In the magical world of Tinteria, a story about how heroines are made. This story took place many years ago in a magical land called Tinteria. It's where the fairy creatures that sometimes enter our world come from. To be allowed to enter the human world, a fairy or elf must prove his or her worth. 2 races of elves lived in the land, the Listers and the Xanders, separated by a high mountain range. Elves aren't born here, they grow in eggs high in the mountains in the caves of Fante. When an elf family wants a new baby, they climb up the mountain in search of the cave and choose an egg. Each egg has at least one tiny elf baby in it. They believe they'll find the egg that's right for them. They take the egg home, warm it and talk to it. Eventually the warmth and love makes the egg pop open and the baby, or babies, emerge. Now that's where the similarities between the 2 races stops and the difference begin, but more about that later. First of all, let's hear the story of Abitrix and Har. Abitrix and Har were a couple of Listers. They decided to raise a child together and dug up a beautiful egg in the mountain cave. It was blue and cold. They took it back to their home. They could see inside the outline of 2 tiny elflings. One looked especially sweet and pretty. Abitrix sang to the capsule and warmed it. The sweet baby girl elfling defrosted first. Abitrix scooped her up and named her Jezra. She smiled at her and cared for her. Har wanted to be a good dad, but he'd often get thunderstorms in his heart. Then he was angry and scary. This made Abitrix grumpy and a bit scary too. Now you'll remember that in Tinteria there was another race of elves who could also raise elflings from the same mountain caves, and that there were big differences between how the 2 races raised their elflings. Abitrix and Har were Listers. Listers had been brought up to believe that the best way to ensure your child was a worthy elf that might someday go to the human world was to spot which child showed the most potential. The one who seemed to be the best, the pretty one, the sweet one. They then pour all their attention and efforts into this child. They would make sure any other children got some food and clothes, but all their attention and effort and the best of everything would go to the child who seemed to have the most potential. And if they got angry and scary, they were less likely to take it out on their best child. This was the way things had always been. Centuries of Lister tradition. If you want to raise a worthy elf, you have to give one everything you've got. And the other, more ordinary elf? Well, they'd be just fine. Surely they'd want their brother or sister to be one of the chosen ones. It was a sacrifice that just had to be made. Not everyone believed this in Tinteria. The Xanders had other ideas, but as I said, more about that later. Har and Abitrix had yet another really big row, and shortly after, the second little elfling at Abitrix's house started to defrost. During the row, Har hurt Abitrix. This was happening more and more often, and she hurt Har back. Poor Jezra was only tiny, too tiny to help, and she was very frightened. And into this house, just after Har had stormed out, baby Chuck hatched. He was very cute and tiny. Most mothers would have scooped him up in delight. Abitrix didn't even notice him defrosting at first. Her eyes were too full of tears from Har's anger to see properly. Her ears were still ringing with the words he said to hear the tiny, weak cry. Her heart didn't seem to have any songs in it anymore. Chuck had to cry and cry and cry and scream. And then Jezra and Abitrix noticed him. Abitrix looked very cross. Jezra was frightened of her mother's anger. She was too little to look after a baby, but she toddled over and picked him up. Eventually, Abitrix noticed her new baby. She knew she should be pleased to have another perfect baby elf, but she wasn't. She did try to care for Chuck and Jezra. She wanted to do the right thing, but her heart was so sad and angry about Har that it made her voice sad and angry, and the songs didn't come out right. She lost her temper often, and she forgot to feed the elflings when they were hungry. And looking after elflings was made even more difficult by the pesky dwarves. Dwarves would come around and distract Abitrix with their magic, and she didn't have the energy to tell them to go away. She was too exhausted by the sadness. Abitrix's head was so sad about the rows with Har and so fuzzy with the dwarf magic that it was hard to concentrate on what the elflings needed. It meant she didn't see what little Chuck and Jezra needed. Sometimes they'd go hungry. Sometimes they'd be sad with no one to comfort them. They learned from pretty little that they'd have to take care of themselves. Jezra tried to help Chuck as best she could, to protect him, to give him food and hugs, but Jezra was only a little elfling herself. Jezra learned that the best, in fact, the only way to avoid getting attacked by Ha's anger was to be perfect, to become the good girl. She learned that the best way to stop her mother getting angry was to be sweet. She was only tiny, and she thought it must be her job to stop her parents getting angry. She did this by being good and sweet and gentle. She would smile when she was sad. She would swallow down any scared or frightened feelings and smile and look happy. She would put away any anger she felt and look sweet and gentle. She knew it was the only thing she could do that might stop that awful anger coming out of her and hurting her and her mother and Chuck. When she wasn't distracted, Abby Trix would watch her two children. She saw Jezra always looking happy and sweet. She thought it was clear who was the most likely to become a worthy elf. So when she did have some energy, she did what years of literary tradition had taught her and put it all into making Jezra become stronger, kinder and cleverer. It was like she didn't even see Chuck when Jezra was there. Jezra thought this might be a good thing, the best way to keep Chuck safe from her black moods and anger. She realised that to stay safe, to be sure of surviving in this scary world, she must be good, sweet, and not let anyone know about her tricky feelings. It was the smart thing to do, given the circumstances. There wasn't anyone who could help with those feelings anyway. Now, I've not forgotten that I haven't told you about the other race, the one that lived on the other side of Tinteria. Their beliefs were quite different. According to Xander's legends and Ye Old Book of Xander Fables, the best way to raise a worthy elf was to work hard to turn all your children into worthy elves. Experience had taught them that sometimes worthiness is found in the most unlikely of people. So amongst the Xanders, all children are given to equally. Their parents give each child just what they need to be the best that they can be. No matter how big or small or weak or strong, pretty or boring, sweet or busy, whether they seem kind or cruel, whether they do what they're told or are always in trouble. In fact, legend has it that some of the most famous, glorious Xander elves started out life as elflings that seemed to be naughty and always in trouble. The Xanders knew, as the listers did not, that challenges can make us stronger, and starting out life at the bottom doesn't mean you have to stay there. Now, amongst the Xanders, there was one particularly special family. The mother in this family was called Priabeth. The father was called Trivoli. Now, if there was one thing Priabeth loved, it was digging up new elfling eggs in the mountain caves, taking them home and learning about the new tiny elfling inside and discovering all she or he had the potential to be. Priabeth was a kind and caring mother. She'd made it her life's work to raise up children who could become worthy elves. She loved nothing more than having children in her home and giving each one exactly what he or she needed to grow up to be the very best elf that they could be. She had had so many capsules from the caves that she wasn't allowed any more. There had to be enough to go round for new parents. Now that her children were all grown up, she yearned to help more children realise their potential. She just felt that there was elflings missing from her heart, her mind, and her dining room table. I'll come back to Priabeth later. Back to Abby Trix. Try as she might, she couldn't rid herself of the unhelpful dwarfs that came around with their exhausting and confusing magic. Nor could she get rid of the anger and sadness in her heart. And although she saw that Ha was too angry and not safe to be a dad, she couldn't bear to leave him. One day, the family went out into the mountains for a day out. But as often happened, Ha got angry and Abby Trix got angry. They were hurting each other. And they got scarier and scarier. So Jezra and Chuck ran away and hid behind a tree. Now amongst the listers, everyone is out for themselves, preoccupied with their ambition to create a worthy elf that no one, just no one, would take on an extra elflin. So Jezra and Chuck didn't have anybody to go to. They stayed hiding, and eventually the sounds of their parents' fights faded into the distance as they moved further and further away. Jezra and Chuck stayed behind the tree, holding on tightly to one another. Now that day, it just so happened that Priabeth, see, I said I'd come back to her, had gone on a walk, and she somehow found herself wandering at the mountains with a longing in her heart for more elflings to take home. There she saw Jezra climbing a tree in search of food and Chuck cowering at the bottom. They both looked lost and alone. Her heart went out to them. Being a kind and caring Xander, she approached them and asked if they needed any help. As soon as she looked into their eyes, her heart melted. She knew that these two Lister elflings were just to be missing from her heart, her table and her home. Once they explained that their parents were fighting, scary, and didn't seem to want them and had forgotten them, she scooped them up and took them home. She lavished on them all the love, attention, food and happiness every good Xander had been brought up to show. Now you might think this is going to be the happy ending. Well, hold on. I promise the ending is happy, but we're not there quite yet. What happened next wasn't exactly what Priya-Beth expected. Firstly, Chuck began to grow in every way. He grew bigger and stronger and smarter. Although it took him a little longer than an average Xander child, he caught up. He learned to be kind, to be helpful, to make magic potions and weave spells, just like any other Xander child. Priya-Beth was delighted and so proud of him. So far, so good. But Jezra, who had seemed so sweet and gentle when she first arrived, remember, she had been hiding big feelings of anger, sadness and fear for many years. They were like a lake inside, held up by a dam, while the love she got from Priya-Beth made her feel a bit safer. And Priya-Beth's love melted that dam. The feelings started to trickle out, in screams, in throwing things and shouting. And then the trickle became a stream and then a river. The feeling got bigger and boom, the dam burst. All the feelings flowed right out. Sometimes they even came out in hurting feet and flying fists. Jezra could see Chuck being kind and cute and not getting told off the way she was. It was then she realised she was no longer the sweet gentle one. She thought, because she'd been brought up to be a Lister, that Chuck was going to be the one who was going to be chosen in the family. He was the one who would get all the attention and love, and she was going to be left out, to be unlovable and not good enough. Jezra was filled with sadness for losing that place as the good one. Jealous feelings for all the love that Jezra had filled her heart. Angry feelings for Chuck for taking that love. And these feelings came out too. She just couldn't seem to hold them in. And she started to worry that Priya-Beth and Trivoli wouldn't keep her. And that feeling flowed out too. Although she wanted to do what she was asked, the bigger the feelings got, the more impossible that became. Priya-Beth was totally confused. This didn't happen in the world of Xanders. She knew, or she thought she did, that if you love each child and give them what they individually need, they will grow and become the best that they can be. Why wasn't this happening with Jezra as it had with all her other children? Why did Jezra's feelings keep getting bigger and bigger? And she kept seeming less and less able to learn what to do. Jezra sensed Priya-Beth's confusion and frustration, and she thought it meant that Chuck was the special one now, and then her feelings of hurt got even bigger. Typically in Xander families, when one child learns new skills, like making potions, the others become so excited and proud that they develop new skills themselves. But Chuck doing well didn't seem to make Jezra happy. Priya-Beth spent much of her time agonising over what she was missing. What was it that Jezra needed that she wasn't giving her? She loved her so much. Why wasn't her love enough to make her grow? Why did things seem to be going backwards? Now, it's a funny thing that although Xanders and Listers were only separated by the mountains, and although they both regularly sent elves all the way to our world, where we call them fairies, they tended not to mix and knew very little about each other. For centuries, each had gone on living their own traditions, each sure that their way was best, unaware of the beliefs of others. One day, Priya-Beth was sat by the beautiful lake of Discoverton. Jezra and Chuck were at school. She worried about whether the other children were being kind to Jezra. She worried about whether the teachers could see, like she could see, that Jezra was unhappy, and her smile was just like a cover on a book, covering up the pain underneath. She worried whether Jezra would be able to concentrate on any schoolwork. She wondered whether Jezra was feeling bad about herself. Really, Priya-Beth spent much of her life worrying about Jezra. Then along came a white wizard called Reyes. The wizard was an old traveller. Having spent much of his life travelling around the land, he was very wise. Priya-Beth started talking to him and eventually, out of her heart, spilled all the worry about Jezra. Reyes listened carefully to all she had to say. Then he explained what he knew about Listers. Siblings like Jezra and Truck were raised to be competitive, to believe that only one of them could be favoured and loved. Reyes suggested that Jezra probably finds it hard to believe that she can be loved and cared for when Chuck is doing well. He wondered whether, deep in Jezra's heart, she only believed that Priya-Beth could love one of them. It couldn't possibly be both. Rhea suggested that when Chuck was doing things right, which was quite a lot, Jezra was likely to feel hopeless. And as we all know, without hope, no one can grow. He wondered if, when Jezra's feelings came out in ways that make her new family sad, like hurting or shouting, it made her all the more sure that she couldn't be loved. Priya-Beth thought all these things over and decided it made a lot of sense. The next day she talked to Jezra. She told her about the list to race. How there, deep in Jezra's heart, she would have learnt to believe that, if she was in trouble more than her brother, that meant there was something wrong with Jezra and she would never be loved. Priya-Beth told her that she understood why Jezra might believe that, but explained that it wasn't true. That Xanders don't love children because they don't make mistakes. They love children because they are their children, and that they don't love any one more than the other. One being less well-behaved doesn't make them any less loved or special. There is no competition. She reminded Jezra that both races get their babies from the same caves, that had their egg been dug up by a Xander family, and how Priya-Beth wished it could have been her and Trivoli, they would have grown up knowing they were loved and special, even if one of them was sweeter or better behaved, and that there would have been moments when she seemed kinder and more skilled than her brother, and times when he'd see better than her, and that was just what everybody expected. Priya-Beth told Jezra how sad she felt if Jezra believed that she could only be loved and special if she was better than her brother, because she, Priya-Beth, really loved her so very much and spent so much time thinking about her that made her very, very, very special indeed. Jezra listened, though she found it hard. At first she couldn't really believe it was true, because the things that we learn when we are tiny babies stick to us like superglue. Could Priya-Beth really love her just as she was, even at times when her anger was like a destroying flood? It sounded like a fairy tale, a fantasy film, not real life. At first, all there was that day was a teeny tiny acorn of hope that maybe, just maybe, both she and her brother could be loved and favoured together. Did you guess what happened next? Yes, little by little that acorn started to grow. It was carefully watered by Priya-Beth's love and her reminder that she had time and love enough for both Jezra and Chuck, and her understanding that it was hard for Jezra to believe in her love. Sometimes the acorn of hope took a knock, but each time it did, Priya-Beth carefully replanted the little seedling until one day it grew into a mighty tree in Jezra's heart. And that day, Jezra started to believe that she, yes, Jezra, could grow up to be worthy, to be kind and strong and lovable. And after that, you wouldn't believe how quickly she changed, how much easier it was for her to start to sort through the well of tricky feelings left in her heart. From a tiny elfling to a worthy elf. Now she is known as Jezra the Majestic, and she regularly flies to our world to do good deeds here. Priya-Beth is so proud of both her and Chuck that it makes her heart swell. The end.